Okay, one other segment we need to talk about is some of the electronic wiring we need to do for our flight controller and ESC, or ESCs, I guess I should say. Okay, so here on the right we have our flight controller. This is a Maytech H743 Slim. This is the V3 version of this flight controller. Okay, and then on the left here we have a SkyStars. What is this? A K055 BLHeli S 3 to 6S 4-in-1 ESC. Okay, and so we'll be using these together in our build, right, to allow us to control the quadcopter, control the motors, to fly. And this is the heart and brawn of the quadcopter, basically. Okay, so let's talk about the ESC first. I'll go on to the flight controller. We'll zoom in a little bit more. Zoom in, just move the camera closer, basically. But okay, so here we have our ESC. We have two large plus and minus leads down here with two smaller holes. Okay, we have 6 pads on each side in groups of 3, and then we have a set of, what is that, 8 pins? 8 pins or pads up on the top, which are complemented by a actual plug harness on the back. Okay, and here's the back of the ESC. We have these gummies or vibration dampeners in the ESC itself. Okay, these gummies are asymmetrical, so they're larger on one side than on the other. You want to install them in this fashion with the larger side on the top if you're going to build your quad like I do in the instruction videos. So I would recommend that. That gives us plenty of clearance from the bottom of the ESC to the bottom plate of the quadcopter and seems to fit well, so we can do that way. Okay. So as we talked about in the other video, these pads here along the side are for our motors. One, I'm not going to number them correctly, but just here's 1 motor, here's 2 motor, 3 motor, 4 motor. Okay, they do have little numbers there as well. You'll see different manufacturers number things different ways, so we really just got to get it onto the quadcopter and figure out which number is which. Set of 3 is for 1 motor. Okay, here in the back we have our power leads. You'll see the negative and the positive. With your ESC, you will have received some wires like this in the package, as well as an XT60 connector, which we talked about in the other video as well. Okay, you can use these wires if they reach for you to where you need them to reach. You can use other wires if you want, but pay attention, these are 14 gauge wire. Okay, so we want to use at least 14 gauge, if not a larger wire, as in a smaller gauge number like 12. You don't need to go any farther than that, like 10 gauge would be probably overkill. But if you need some other wire, make sure you grab 14 gauge if you need to make the leads longer for some reason. Okay. The XT60, we talked about how to solder these in class already, right? We attach the wires like so. This gray piece that we haven't talked about too much, okay? This piece is meant to cap the end of the XT60, okay? So if you have already soldered to your flight controller, or your ESC, sorry, you already soldered to here, and you're going to solder the connector on second, make sure you install this gray piece over the wires, okay, before you solder them to the XT60. Because once both ends are soldered, you can't really install this gray piece anymore. Okay, so only solder one end and then put on the gray piece, or put on heat shrink if you want. And the gray piece, once these wires are soldered, will then slide up and over and basically cover up those exposed joints, so that way we don't have anything that can touch or short out the power. Okay, so it kind of just clips on there, a little bit of force, but it'll click on, and then you'll be covered there as far as exposed solder joints. Okay, back to the ESC here. So in addition to those larger holes in there on the sides for the wires themselves, there's 2 smaller holes here. And what those are for is this capacitor. Well, this is a capacitor. It comes with your ESC. This particular one happens to be a 35 volt, 560 microfarads. If you're from electronics and stuff, you may be familiar with what those terms mean. Basically, this one should be fine for what we're using on our copter. We could use a bigger capacitor if we wanted to, and have some potential advantages there, but this one should be sufficient. Okay. What capacitors do is they help with voltage spikes. Okay, so as our battery is inputting power to the ESC and stuff, the voltage can briefly spike, and voltage spikes can damage things, right? And so this capacitor kind of acts as a absorber. It'll kind of absorb some of those spikes and smooth things out, and that way we don't damage our components, at least not as soon, right? Over time, everything kind of gets damaged in general, but this should help us have much longer lifespan out of our ESC, and be able to do that. It's a 35 volt, which is great because our ESC is 3 to 6S. 3S is about 12 volts, 6S is about 25 volts, 24 volts. Okay, so this is plenty for what we need here. If we only had like a 20 volt capacitor, that wouldn't work very well because we need this capacitor to be rated for the same voltage this is, in case we ever plug in a 6S battery to our setup. We'll be using 4S batteries this semester and in subsequent semesters, so we have plenty of overhead. Okay, you might have noticed on the capacitor there's this large white band with these kind of minus looking signs. Also on the capacitor itself, there's one leg that is shorter than the other leg. Okay, this shorter leg with the minus signs is the negative side of the capacitor, and the other leg is the positive leg. There's nothing to show that, but if we know this side is negative, sorry, the focus is really bad. Come on, camera. You know, this side is negative, the other side must be positive. Okay, so when we install the capacitor, I like this ESC has separate holes for it, so we don't have to worry about heating this part up to attach the wire and the capacitor falling off. Okay, what you want to do is basically figure out how you're going to mount your wires. Okay, if you're going to do some kind of a castellated hole attachment where you attach the wires in here like this, have them flex over. There's enough pad here that you could just probably attach them in this fashion. Okay, so we don't have them going up. I would probably recommend that if you're able to do that. If we have them going up, it would probably be okay. We want to make sure that we're not going to run into things that are above us, like our flight controller and things like that. Okay, so perhaps laying them down will be a little bit better. But as we attach our wires, okay, as you solder them in place, you may solder them exactly straight, so they're coming straight out from the ESC. You might not be paying attention. You might get them a little bit inwards, so that the wires kind of end up like this more. Okay, they kind of are angled inwards. Or we might even get them the other way so they're angled outwards. Okay, we want to make sure we're doing is accommodating the capacitor somewhere in there. Okay, if you would like to have the capacitor right between the wires, you need to make sure the wires can be spread enough the capacitor can fit between the wires. Okay, you can also just have the capacitor slightly above the wires. That's not a problem. The wires are installed here, nice and straight. Okay, sorry, it's hard to hold all this. Nice and straight. The capacitor can be slightly above the wires. Okay, just kind of in a bundle like that. That's totally fine as well. Okay, just realize you need to have them work together a little bit somehow. So whether you want to attach the capacitor first, which I would probably recommend, doing the capacitor first and then the wires. If you happen to do the wires first, then you might need to make adjustments to fit the capacitor. Okay, so probably a better way to do it is the capacitor first. Let's talk about that. I'm going to have my negative and my positive. So I can thread those leads through these holes. Okay, and then I can have them come through the other side. Now the capacitor itself is going to be not sticking up like this. We want to have it laying down, so probably I'll give myself a little bit of slack and kind of bend it over like so, across the board like that. Okay, coming out nice and flat. Okay, we don't want to have it too close to the board so it's touching the board. We don't want to have it too far away so it's just wobbling out here on really long leads. But somewhere in the middle is a pretty good spot. We can then go ahead and solder or tin the back side here of those where the capacitor leads come through. So get that to focus a little bit better. You can solder the back side here so the leads can't come out. You can also solder on the top side. Okay, then you can trim these legs off so they're not sticking out like this, of course. But now the capacitor is attached, so that's great. You do want to be aware, though, as you heat up these pads on the sides, these little capacitor pads may also heat up and may loosen the capacitor slightly. So make sure you have it kind of physically secured, maybe with some blue tack or something like that. So when you're attaching the wires, you don't all of a sudden have your capacitor fall off, because that's a bummer. Okay, but that's a good way to attach it there. You trim the leads and then attach your wires here on either side. And there's your capacitor. Okay, so that should cover most of anything we need for the ESC. I'm going to talk about this harness here in a minute on the next video. But on these motor wires, you notice as well, the pads are castellated, slightly castellated, but they also have a large pad on top. So I would probably just solder the wire right on top. Okay, unless you want to use the castellations and have it run like this or like this. Okay, hopefully that helps. And that should give us what we need for the ESC.